Hey all, happy Monday. I'm just back from Zurich in Switzerland, trying to save the world with some other people over there, of course. And here's a special for you. I got with Neil Oliver last week and the edit's just out. We had a superb conversation. We covered, as you can imagine, everything: philosophical, historical, geopolitical, the whole lot. So enjoy.
Today's guest is a chemical engineer, which is a line of work that falls into that category of jobs, which is a big category of jobs for me, which I don't really understand. But my dad-in-law, Trudy's dad, is an engineer and a rotating machinery engineer. And because of the word engineer, I am always open to listening to people that have practical problem-solving skills that I lack. So Ivor's professional background is interesting to me. He's someone that I automatically pay attention to, as well as being in the chemical engineering line. Specifically, to focus that down, Ivor's working life has been about leading teams to solve problems. And by God, we don't have problems to solve at the moment. And if an engineer can bring that kind of skill set, then I am ready to listen. Good afternoon, Ivor Cummins. Good to see you.
Good afternoon, Neil. Great to see you. Great to be here.
Science is not my world. I'm an arts graduate from university several thousand years ago. I just thought I'd kick off by inviting you to speculate about in that context of problem solving, which science sounds like the best means to solve problems. Has the public perception of science been damaged and undermined by events in the last several years?
Yeah, well, one would certainly hope it has. And I think it has to an extent. The problem is 3 generations since World War II, the people have become very soft and very gullible and very compliant. And they've been inundated for decades now with this messaging from schools, universities, corporate employment scenarios. The idea is listen to the experts and trust the science. So we give up our personal autonomy, common sense, our own innate problem solving and kind of cynical nature, and we just defer to the authorities. So yeah, I mean, in 2020, when the wave broke on us, and this cerveza sickness, I believe, to keep it YouTube friendly, friends of mine are saying, this cerveza sickness came out. Well, people, they really weren't tooled up to be able to think critically about complex virology, epidemiology, and immunology. So they really got taken by surprise. And we saw this horrific kind of compliance with all this nonsense, the self-evident nonsense. But then since then, just to cut ahead, we might come back to that period, but since then, people have begun to observe that most of what was said back then was wrong. And the conspiracy theorists were pretty much all correct. So I think it's seeping in. Now, a lot of them, Neil, they won't admit it. Like, I have friends who kind of cancelled me, and a few of them uncancelled me after 2 years, a month or two ago. But like, you don't talk about the war. So I went along, I was invited for a couple of drinks, and I went along and expressly I decided I'm not going to mention the war, and I didn't, and they didn't either. So it's like, begrudgingly, they know, okay, I was pretty much correct, it turns out, and I was unfairly cancelled. But you know what? It's a bit embarrassing, it's awkward, and it's a very heavy topic. So people who took the magic sauce, the new medication to save granny, right? A lot of them now kind of think that was a bit weird, and I'm not really that happy I went along with it, but they won't admit it. Because it's deeply, deeply personal to admit you were wrong. The experts were wrong. All of the scientists were wrong. Can't go there.
Yeah, I know, I do know that, but it does, I've realized it does, I'm intrigued by it because I have found it genuinely liberating. And I know that all sounds a bit new agey, but I found it liberating to think that what I had thought, the paradigm that I had accepted, it freed me up when I thought, wait a minute, I think there's a whole lot of that possibly most of it, I ought not to have been accepting it at face value. And the journey, if you like, or whatever the process and the project that I've been on for the last few years, I have found enormously invigorating. It's not, I don't cleave naturally to my understanding of before. I did that. It's like a skin I shed, and it does interest me, almost like a philosophical level, why the people you're describing are so determined to hold on to information and an understanding that they presumably know didn't actually serve them well when it mattered.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and I'm similar to yourself. Now, I have the advantage of nearly 30 years in corporate. I was involved in all kinds of skullduggery, I guess. So I was kind of under no illusions about how the world of science and industry worked and government. So I would be less surprised at this insane level of skullduggery. I'd also spent the last 10 years in the whole cholesterol and fat and statins and all the nonsense we've been fed on that. So I realized in the last 10 years, most things are so biased to the point that they're just lies. Most of the key things were sold. But yeah, why do people who are not blessed with that background, so they really do find it startling that the experts are wrong and governments lie to us, wholesale. Why? I think it's kind of fear at one level. Many of them that I know have pretty significant corporate jobs or public service, senior levels, quite a lot of them. And they just know that this stuff is toxic waste to their career. They know that people in their professional associations, if they hear them even whispering some of this stuff, they'll be called conspiracy theorists. They'll be perceived as off the wall. So this group fear, and also fear, I think, that deep down, it's actually quite terrifying for most people to live in a world where all of our nice governments and our diversity leads and all of our NGOs that are trying to help people, that they're all corrupt, rotten, feeding us lies. That's a scary thought in itself. And psychologically, sometimes when something is really scary and a little overpowering, like we're living in a complete sham in many ways, sometimes the psychological choice is to just create your frame of reference that you shut it out. And this final point, this thing has been proven scientifically that when someone is in a society or a tribe, Homo sapiens, and the whole tribe is going a certain way and insistent on a certain thing, like let's say religion or ideology, if they find that they don't believe any of it and they think it's complete crap, after a few weeks where they have to go along with it, because otherwise they'll get in trouble, they actually reset their mental frame of reference because the tension within them becomes difficult to bear. And they actually psychologically reset their frame of reference to choose to accept the tribe's view. And then their life gets easier, right? So I think that's touching on the mechanism you're kind of wondering about. People reset their frame of reference to where they can be more comfortable and safer.
I look on at the forces ranged against us, let's say, whatever, as they manifest, at least in the public domain, that we're invited or allowed to see the World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization and so on and so on. But in any event, the forces ranged against us, and to keep it in the context of how I introduced you, I can only imagine that those entities see us, Homo sapiens, in its entirety as a problem to be solved. We are a problem. We are in some way an obstacle to where they want to be. So we'll take that. Let's take that as read. Do you think that when it comes to the forces, are we dealing with a coordinated, tight, focused team of the sort that I can only presume you sought to lead when it came to solving a problem? Or are we at the mercy at the moment of disconnected entities indulging in a kind of a game of supermarket sweep, just as they see everything as a clock ticking down, are various groups that are competitive amongst themselves, just trying to grab what they can.
Yeah, that's a big question. So, well, you're familiar with my story from Dr. Jakob Nordengord of the Rockefellers in the 50s. And they they donated the land for the UN buildings, a huge New York, huge value tract of land. They funded and helped set up the United Nations. Nordengord said the Rockefellers perceived it as their own kind of private club early on. Now it's got much bigger. But Rockefeller essentially created the WEF, the Club of Rome, the Trilateral Commission, ultimately Bilderberg, and you could go on and on. So basically, there's a huge amount of structure between the Rockefellers and all these leaders and groups that they've set up. And we know the WEF has put 4,000 young global leaders through its Young Global Leader Indoctrination Program since 1993. Gates was one of the first boys in. We know how he's done good for them, right? But there's a huge amount of structure, corporate structure, and I've seen the power of corporate structure during my career. When the VPs up top decide we're doing X and the employees are going to hate it, like once we had a 5% pay cut while the corporation was still making big profits. You imagine how that went down. But the VPs on the board have the power, and they made us middle managers roll out that policy. And we had to, because our job depended on it. Otherwise, we'd be demoted. So the corporate structures leading from the top do work really well and are very effective, especially when you've got tons of money to deploy, like Rockefeller, WEF, etc. So there is all that structure. But then again, now they're seeing big headwinds because they've shown their hand with the cerveza sickness. And a lot of people are beginning to wake up, obviously. And the WHO World Health Regulations change and pandemic treaty essentially failed recently. And Europe is moving to the right, not the far right, just to slightly right of center, anti-globalist, which is good. So all these parts are moving. So I think it's a mixture of both. Yes, there's a huge amount of organization and structure which has delivered. I mean, how else could they, on the back of a common cold equivalent or bad flu equivalent, look what they did. That's power, that's structure. But there's also infighting, I think. Now, one of the most interesting things I heard was in Dubai in March. I was at a kind of hedge fundy conference. I went to speak there. And someone on the inside, I'm not sure the details, but pretty close to the upper tables, was hearing it that the original powers in the world, the Rothschilds, the Wagners, the hundreds of trillions of banking money that you could say was very much behind World War I and World War II, you know, those huge families with infinite wealth and connections straight through to governments, a lot of this is on the record now, that they're somewhat beginning to fall out with the new corporate structure of totalitarianism, which is Rockefeller, WEF, State Department, CIA, military industrial complex, etc., etc. That's the alliance. But apparently the old powers, which some people would say is behind Rockefeller and State Department, the word coming out was that they're beginning to not be comfortable with the way it's going. Maybe they preferred their own kind of quiet totalitarianism. And they didn't particularly want a Malthusian depopulation, China-style social credit, crazy world like the new crew clearly want.
Do you think
I think there's all these tensions.
You make it sound, it's a bit like old world stuff about aristocracy, monarchy. You know, the old families that whatever held landed estates before the time of nation states. You know, when it was just your Romanovs in Russia and your Tudors and people in England and, the great families who by nature were, I suppose, kind of small c conservative, like hawk roosting, that sort of Ted Hughes idea of, this is the way things have always been. I'm going to keep things like this forever. That kind of conservative, into which has come a kind of bourgeoisie, new money, in the form of the technocrats, maybe, you're whatever, the Zuckerbergs, as they are fronted by the Zuckerbergs and fronted by the Gates and so on, that those people are just like whatever avatars or factotums of something, of a technocracy. I wonder, it almost sounds as if it's like there's now an existential push and pull between old world aristocrats going back however long and new money, bourgeoisie, technocrats, new kids on the block, new sheriff in town.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. And maybe earlier on, possibly back in the 50s and 60s, John Dee, of course, was funded by the Rothschilds way back, and his whole oil magnate kind of domination of that sphere. So maybe there was a point in time where, in a sense, the big families that ruled the world for the last 100 years were kind of the power behind their throne. But I think, yeah, there's possibly a schism of sorts. We don't know for sure, but what you're describing, Neil, is very reasonable. That the technocrats, and when you bring in State Department, CIA, and all of this, these power players, who have literally have the power of life and death. We all know this. And you got the whole military industrial complex and the pharmaceutical industrial complex. And they're all aligned into stakeholder capitalism, this vision of a totalitarian world with all saving granny language and other nonsense. This new technocracy structure maybe has just gotten bigger than the old powers fully allowed for. And I think there's a slight difference of opinion maybe manifesting. And there's an example, not that specific one, but the other day it was quite interesting. And some of my pals in the US said, look, it's another psyops. But I found it very interesting. Not that they're genuine, not that they mean what they say, and not that it isn't some kind of psyop. However, the Wall Street Journal would only gush positively about the World Economic Forum for decades, including all through the COVID, cerveza sickness madness. They always speak positively because they're connected through to the bankers, the central bankers, and that's all part of this technocracy, the new technocracy. So that's fine. But a day or two ago, they did a hit piece on Klaus Schwab, and it was pretty severe. I mean, it was a front page style article about use of the N-word by Schwab's organization. One of his senior leaders in the presence of black people used the N-word. Several female whistleblowers came out and they lost their jobs when they got pregnant. Now you can understand why Schwab would be furious, because he's a Malthusian. He wants depopulation. He's not going to be happy when senior staff get pregnant. And there was also sexual harassment charges. But the article read like a Zero Hedge article. It's pretty steamy and seriously critical. And at the end, it did a big section pretty much reminding us that Schwabi was out during the cerveza sickness saying we need a great reset and now is the moment. And basically he backed lockdowns and basically said we don't have enough lockdowns. So they reminded readers at the end, by the way, this is the guy, right, the non-profit NGO guy, Schwab, who's dripping in money and corporate money, telling us all how to behave while flying around in private jets. And it reminded us at the end of the article, essentially, this is the scumbag who tried to push through a technocracy on the back of a cold. So a very powerful article. But how did that come from the Wall Street Journal? And there's various rumors, but one of them is that, what's his name, the big media magnate who has kept Sky News Australia pretty good over the last few years, Murdoch, is it? Yeah. That maybe he is pushing his influence because he has a share ownership in Wall Street Journal. Or maybe now they're reading the room. Maybe now there's elements that were completely rolling over because they were feeding like pigs at the trough. All the media, all the pharma, all these partners of World Economic Forum were feeding like mafia, wetting their beaks all during COVID, and they were having a great time. But maybe now they're reading the room and realizing, okay, hold on a minute. I'm not sure this nonsense will work. A lot of people are questioning it.
So do you think that neo-Malthusian, whatever, eugenicist, anti-human, whatever title you might want to put on it, do you think it's that has been being pushed most recently by the new money, the new kids on the block, rather than the old, like you say, whatever, conservative, been around forever, that kind of Fabian approach to things, that kind of softly, slowly. So you think that kind of because I bracket it with this idea, the transhumanist movement, this assumption that's being pushed that the biological human being Mark One is suboptimal after 7 million years of evolution, and we've now got to upgrade it with circuit boards. So you think could that be the point of conflict, that possibly the older money is not so committed to whittling away at the population?
Yeah, I think there may be an element of that. Now, the older families who gamed and bet on both sides of World War One and World War Two, and remember Nathan Rothschild said back when the USA, I forget the date, you'd probably know the dates, but when they were going and using their own script, and it became apparent to the Crown in England and to the big powers that they're going with no interest, like they're removing usury.
Colonial script under Lincoln, yes, you can't. You can't. And the Bradbury pound before the First World, yes. At the time of the First World War, zero interest, zero debt, treasury money, not banknotes.
Well, America was booming because as soon as you remove the usury, the interest rate, economies are based on real assets and real money, and you've taken out the interest, and they bloom. You've got true free trade, true capitalism, and they bloom. But Nathan Rothschild said to whoever the prime minister was at the time, and it's on the historical record, and he said, basically that lot over there can forget about that system. And he said, they're going to have a ruinous war if they don't drop this system, like pronto. And that's on the historical record. And the likes of Rothschild, they were capable of bringing a war to a huge nation. No problem. They pick up the phone or whatever they used back then, and things happen. And of course, you had the wars between England and America, and you had all the, like, when they brought back in a system of interest rate and central banking, then you have your depressions, you have your economic cycle, you have boom and bust, you have the middle class are compressed like we're seeing in the recent decades especially. The rich get richer. Everything goes to hell in a handbasket, but a small schism get much richer. But back to your original question. So the big families, I think they were happy as a pig in shite when the wars killed millions of people, because to these big families, just like to these new technocrats, people are just scum, broadly speaking. So they had no problem with millions dying. Sure, listen, they're only ants. But I don't think they had a driven goal to depopulate and reduce the human population. I think that's, to your point, that's an attribute or a quality of the new technocracy. They love their futuristic mumbo jumbo. I mean, Rockefellers were up to their neck in the future society, and all this futurists were brought into the World Economic Forum even back in the 70s and the 80s. They had futurists all the time. It goes with their Malthusian vision, all that human 2.0 nonsense. It's all just grist to the mill for them. So yeah, I think the new technocrats are much more Malthusian, much more depopulation focused. I mean, they literally froth themselves at the idea of abortion. You know what I mean? Essentially, George Gammon, who talks about this a lot, he's a great guy. You should look at his YouTube channel. As he says, like, they basically, the easiest phrase to describe all these people is anti-human. Because Malthusianism, you may be familiar or not, they are anti-human. Every single thing that they push, from climate change, taking away energy, taking away wholesome ancestral meat, which made us as a species by eating it for millions of years, and by taking away free speech and taking away, ideally, population, promoting abortion, promoting the trans nonsense, right, to reduce family, attacking the family directly, like last year or a while ago in Ireland, we had a referendum to take the family out of the Constitution, and it lost, which is a good sign. But everything they do is anti-human, and the people who scream about all these things are always the offenders themselves. So the climate change screamers, the big ones up the top setting the agenda, are the ones with their soft arses in private jets, right? The ones who scream about racism and inclusion and inclusivity, they're the deepest racists, you know? And I could go on. So you've got all these white guys up the top driving this massive chariot of horror, and they're talking to us the opposite of what they believe. And I'm guessing, Neil, to finish, they're probably having champagne and caviar and laughing at us too. Why wouldn't they?
When I asked you that question about whether you thought it was a coordinated team, pulling together towards solving a problem, I say to my wife, to Trudy, all the time, where do you think the trillionaires or whatever, or that parasite class, or that thin veneer that operate as though they're above and beyond, where do they think they're going to end up? Because chaos is being sown. The mass movement of people, and I understand the agony on both sides of that. I understand 100% the agony of communities that feel themselves being overwhelmed by new arrivals at unprecedented levels. But I also absolutely, feel for the people who are being stirred up like ants in a jar that's been shaken, and they're on the. So I feel only pain and empathy for everybody involved. But I always say to Judy, what makes me wonder if it's just a supermarket sweep and uncoordinated? Are they just themselves wakening up to what must be the consequences of the kind of chaos they've sown? Which is to say, there will be nowhere for anyone, compared to the nice trillionaire life you could have lived 50 years ago before they shook the jar.
Yeah, now that's again a big question. I think, I don't want to retrace what I was saying, but I think the best laid plans of mice and men, I think it is. These guys are super smart. Their corporate structure, from Rockefeller right down to all the other organizations that brought us COVID and are bringing us all the other nonsense. They had a vision, and the vision was for, and Rockefeller coined the phrase, a new world order. Kissinger, in the 91, I think, in the New York Times, the title of his article was The Chance for a New World Order. So they wanted a new world order. And of course, the billionaires and trillionaires would sit at the top. And no matter what happened, the plan was they'd have private jets, caviar, champagne, yachts in the Seychelles. That's guaranteed for the guys at the top. It always is in a totalitarian system, right? So that was the plan. Now, how is the plan evolving? Well, now you've got neocon elements who are very pro-war, who want to destroy Russia. That's another scam. I mean, Putin, in my opinion, from everything I've read, was forced into this after the coup in 2014, NATO impinging on his borders. And I heard from hedge fund guys on the inside that there's a whole bunch of hedge fund managers who are salivating for a full-scale war with Russia so it can be smashed and broken up for parts, basically strip mined. So you've got all these elements, hedge funds, banks, and even State Department neocons who are now maybe going too far, especially as their empire is failing, like drowning in debt in the US. So I think over the last couple of decades, a lot of the plan went well. The awareness that's growing is making it unstable and making a lot more people, including wealthy people, aware of where the world's heading and beginning to get concerned. So that's a destabilizing effect. And also you've got a lot of players that have morphed into being too aggressive and pushing us to the brink of nuclear war, which most of the rich technocrats don't want, for the reasons you said. I mean, they want a nice ant farm. I mean, they salivate when they look at China. You got Xi Jinping there and all of his boys, cigars, champagne, caviar, and they've got a pseudo-capitalist system, so it brings in all the money, and they sit at the top in absolute pinnacle of luxury, even though they run an ant farm with social credit scores and more cameras than humans. I think that's what the plan was from Rockefeller on down, and I think a destabilizing element is coming in with the twin-hander, One, you've got a lot of elements who are a bit crazy, like serious neocon warmongers and the military-industrial complex, pushing really hard because they're partners of this whole system, but they're greedy partners and they're pushing hard. And then you've got awareness growing of what they're at, which is further destabilizing. So I think rifts are appearing. And long may they appear and grow is what I would suggest.
Do you know, for a long time, the image that it brings to my mind is the sequence in Fantasia, where Mickey Mouse, as the baby wizard, as the sorcerer's apprentice, starts the mops and buckets thing.
Yeah.
And he thinks he's great. You know, they're doing all the cleaning. But then all too soon, the whole thing, floodwaters rise and everything's out of control and it's beyond him. I feel that's how it seems to me, that people who were, too clever for their own good, too big for their boots, set the mops dancing. And now they're not, now it's only just beginning to dawn on them that the floodwater's going to make them wet as well, if not drown them. But to get on, you said to me just the other day, something about, how long ago you stopped watching television. It was a long time. You stopped you stopped drinking from that trough. Can you cast your mind back and say what it was way back, whenever that was, that made you think, hang on, there's something agley here?
Well, God, I'm going to have to stretch back. But I know in 2006, when I moved to my presence house, the first thing I did when I got there was I snipped at the front door because I do all the trades as a hobby. So I did up the whole house. So the first thing I did was under the front step, which I was lifting as part of wiring, I cut the television cable and I cut the telephone cable because the Irish telephone service was a scam. And now you had VoIP phone coming out, and I was a bit of a technocrat myself. So I had VoIP phones and I had a business mobile I used for everything. So I cut the phone line, but I also cut the television line. And I'm trying to remember, but at the time we had 4 kids and we stopped at 5 a year or two later. But at the time I instinctively knew that television was dog poo. And I was thinking particularly of the kids. I don't want them exposed to the utter junk that television is. I don't think I was thinking so much, my God, I am being propagandized by this nonsense. I viewed it more as just stupid nonsense from Hollywood. And now the West was losing all of its culture to pure mainline junk coming from America. And I said, I want the kids shielded from that crap. So I think that's what drove me. Now, over the years, as I got involved in corporate shenanigans, I began to realize more and more that the media was clearly biased towards a kind of a corporatocracy agenda. I was noticing in the Irish Times, the paper of record, as I read articles, and the Sunday Times, this is back around 15 years ago, they were not ringing true anymore like real journalism. It almost smelled a bit like advertising on behalf of the government or on behalf of an NGO. It just felt like advertising. It felt like what we would do to employees when we had to roll out a new policy that might not be popular. Let's be honest, managers were expected to manipulate employees and manage their expectations. We used to say manage their perception. We did all the courses on that. I began to feel that the mainstream media and television was acting like we did as managers when we were rolling shit downhill. It was a strong feeling. But I didn't think too much about it. But recently, and this, I'll finish on this, Neil, it is now comical. It's gone full bore. So the Irish Times, the paper of record, is not fit to be yesterday's chip paper, right? To carry your chips in. It's astonishing to me how bad it's got. It's literally a cheerleader for pharma, trans, mass migration, whatever the technocracy wants, the Irish Times pumps it like a torrent. And RTE, the state television in Ireland, if it's possible, it's worse. And it's funded by the government, essentially. And it just kowtows. It's Pravda for Ireland. It, again, comically bad. And most of the other so-called more independent news, like News Talk, all during Cerveza's sickness, and comically recently, a mouthpiece for the WEF. That's all I can describe them as. I mean, I don't read them. People send me articles and I just look and verify. Yeah, mouthpieces. It's astonishing, but I smelled it 10 years ago earlier, but now it's laughable, risible. They're comics. They're all comics now for Stalin.
What I've been looking on at, relatively recently, in terms of we've already touched on the movement of people. Call it immigration, migration, whatever you want to call it. And clearly Ireland, has certainly been thrown into a bright light by the arrival of new people. And I have been watching it, and obviously, because it's always difficult for the reasons you've just elucidated, it's difficult to know how much of reality you're actually seeing and how much is being passed through some kind of corrupting lens. But it would appear that lots of communities up and down Ireland are being overwhelmed, or certainly people are worried and frightened about what's happening. And I grew up, you were of an age, and I grew up watching Ireland through, that period of history bracketed as the Troubles, where there was this message of Ireland for the Irish, Sinn Féin, we ourselves, very defensive about Irishness and Irish culture. And then I watch what's happening now, and I think, how come in that place, in that nation, within that culture that was so seems so sure of itself and seems so ready to defend itself against all comers, why events seem to a completely different sequence of events seems to be unfolding without any apparent check on it, and which makes me think, how much of what I watched growing up in the 70s and 80s was real, and how much of that was choreographed for the bread and circuses for the masses.
Yeah, that period, it's an interesting question. I mean, how much back in the 70s? I think the Troubles were genuine. And again, it's back to 3 generations since World War II. Everyone's just completely soft
I think
now.
They were genuine too. So what's happened since?
So yeah, basically, I think back then, there was genuine struggles, but you had a hardcore minority of people broadly supported by the communities who felt oppressed for generations. There was real anger, and it was real to them. They understood their history. They understood what had happened from the famine to the planting of Ireland, and the UK now being the overlords. Clearly, the UK were bad guys for 800 years of oppression of Ireland. That was all clear and present to the people, and it bubbled over, and people got hard. They got pretty hardcore, and it was pretty bad. Bombings, murders, anything was allowed because this was an existential struggle. So all of that happened. Those people are dead. They're gone. And the whole world has changed, not just since World War II, but particularly the last 30, 40 years. Everyone's been bought off now. We've got very socialist systems. It's a total welfare state. We've been deluged with the kind of niceness propaganda, in a sense, for many decades. And the younger generations are immersed in this. And then our schools and universities have turned into Marxist hotbeds that refocus people on social issues, and sexual stuff and all this junk, right? That's irrelevant to the real world, a real human world that's focuses on important things. So I think everyone's been softened to the point that here we are. And Sinn Féin itself was the biggest cheerleader of lockdowns and new medications, shall we say, during cerveza sickness. And people were astonished at that, similar to your point. But Sinn Féin is meant to be for the working people against the big globalists. It's clearly a globalist scam. And they were screaming at the government in Ireland to lock down harder. They were lobbying the government and putting the government under pressure to do more lockdown. And I think essentially in their case, it's just a running joke at this stage. They have 100% sold out. They don't have a frisson of their original revolutionary, anti-wealthy ideas or beliefs in them. They still say them because they want to keep that vote. They still talk, big talk about, the working man, but they're basically a welfare state promoter, and they have their hand out to the globalists.
It's funny when you say that, because I was watching Tucker Carlson is in Australia, has been for a couple of weeks, and he's been addressing all sorts of audiences all over the place, and I've been dipping in and out of what he's been saying and to whom, and he was giving a kind of a leaving speech the other night, and he was talking about, he poked fun at the Labour Party he said he was very much playing the card of, I didn't know, but I've never been to Australia before, 55 years old, I'm here for the first time, I'm not pretending to know anything about Labour. And so he had been asking, beginners questions about the political situation in Australia, and been told that, one of the main parties was Labour. And then he looked up some of the Labour figures, some of the big names within the Labour Party, and found out that none of them had a job. He was saying you'd kind of expect maybe that people that call themselves Labour might have been electricians or plumbers or scaffolders or drivers or whatever, builders, miners. Not one of them had ever had a job. They were all just full-time, lifetime politicians. And he said, what a joke. How illustrative of the way in which that which once mattered, like Sinn Féin, like Labour, and we've got it in the UK as well. A Labour Party that hates the working people, demonstrably, does everything it can to eradicate the very existence of the kind of traditional indigenous white working class of Britain. You've got to give the devil his due, is what I was going to say. When you watch what's happened to Sinn Féin, hollowed out and now being inhabited by a parasite. Labour in Australia, hollowed out and inhabited by the same parasite. Labour in Britain, hollowed out. It's just wearing the clothes of something that is in every other way dead.
Absolutely. And this again, like George Gammon's point, he reminded me yesterday, but I said it many times before. They are the opposite of what they say. You can almost as a rule, anything they say, the opposite is the correct and right thing for humanity. And Sinn Féin, the Labour Party in both cases, excuse me, they basically have stolen the clothes of something that was real, because they've recognized they're political animals, like you say, they're lifetime politicians, and they know what the little people like. So they give it to them, but they don't mean a single word of it. I mean, clearly, remember New Labour with Blair, and he wanted to bring in ID cards, and he bent over backwards and eventually was beaten on the global ID cards for the UK. We know now he's a young global leader, of course, of World Economic Forum. And that was a direct bidding of the WEF. And the amount of effort he put in. But he was calling himself Labour, to your point. It's just absurd. Like, these people I love the way you use the word parasites. We have a politician class now that literally are parasites. And overwhelmingly, the majority, not all, I always explain to people, they get your vote by telling you the stories that they're smart enough they know you want to hear. And as soon as they get in, they either immediately start reporting up to the UNWEF or the powers that be, the EU Council, right? Because they know what side their bread is buttered on. And they immediately forget and don't care about anything you voted them in for. And that's why the policies all getting talked about in the media in Ireland are not really important things like homeless and housing and young people and healthcare. All of that's gone from the media and the politicians. They all talk about trans and rights and inclusion and how we need to help people by mass migration. So you can see they're wearing it on their sleeve, right? All they are doing is translating directly. They're like Babel fish. They just take the WEF stuff that's told to them, or the EU tells them, which is the same thing, and then they spout it back out, the media and the politicians. They've stolen the clothes, and they are wolves in sheep's clothing, no question about it.
I tend towards the dark. By inclination, I'm a kind of a glass is half empty kind of a human. but I'm aware of it. I've got the self-awareness that, and I know, or I've certainly been saying for the last while that it's an obligation on especially people like me to not submit to it and to be optimistic. It's not, it is a choice, but there's no alternative. You have to be optimistic. And I've heard you say similar. I listen to a lot of your content, and I've heard you saying, I don't know, Viva Frei, and people in very recent times where you've been saying, you've got to be optimistic. And I do genuinely feel it. Now, you're a problem solver. Your kind of like professional DNA is as an engineer, which is to take what's available and assemble it in such a way that it's helpful and solves a problem. How are you driving your innate sense that we have to be optimistic to get ourselves out of this morass?
Yeah, absolutely, Neil. Well, I remember there's a book, a manager I respected hugely back in the day, amazing guy, Jim Martinez. He was over from the West Coast in Ireland. He gave me a book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle
Maintenance.
Yeah. And I didn't find it, I found it a bit turgid reading through it, all the symbolism. But I love the thing about gumption, the concept of quality and the concept of gumption, that when you are in a struggle and you feel like giving up and it's overpowering. In his case, he has a gearbox taken apart, I think, and the pieces are everywhere. And he's just looking, saying, this is not going to work. But you keep at it and at it and at it. And then oftentimes a persistent human will achieve incredible things. And then you get this enormous rush when you've succeeded. And you look back and say, I didn't give up, even when it got really bad. And even when the back was against the wall, we prevailed. And you got to feel that feeling in a really big problem or issue you've been involved in to feel its power. And when you feel it many times, like I've been involved in issues in corporate where we were working 80 hours a week, hundreds of millions of dollars were lost. The plant was going to be shut down, job, mortgage, gone, possibly liability for some people involved. Insane situations going on for weeks and weeks with 4 hours sleep a night. But we prevailed in every case. And when you look back, a friend of mine, a good friend of mine who was the senior manager in the corporate I was in, he actually said it after one massive issue. He said, you know what, Ivor, it's hard to imagine we'll go through something again like that. And if we do, we'll be able to look back and say, we did this one. And it was true. But anyway, I'll get back to the question. Stoicism for me is the place I direct people to, because those old guys cracked it thousands of years ago. If you go deeply into all the works of Stoicism, you'll basically get all the answers. I learned Stoicism personally because of what I tried to articulate there the last couple of minutes. But now I found out after I developed Stoicism, which is what I described, wow, I don't have to explain what I did to everyone now. I can just tell them, go to Stoicism. And I think it encapsulates everything. Memento mori, remember we will all die. We will all die, so you do your best and you do not fear death. And there's amor fati, love fate. Accept that terrible things will happen. Even they have a mental process where you go forward in time to something terrible, the death of a loved one, your own death, a shocking outcome that could happen. But you don't get morose about it. You go there to feel it and then to come back to the present and have no fear of it if it happens. But just say, what can I do today to make the world a better place? There are massive on ethics as well, principle. The quality of your life is based totally on the quality of your thoughts, your subconscious. And that brings up cognitive psychotherapy. A lot of depression and people giving up is subconscious thoughts of, oh my God, this can happen, are going through your head. You don't see them, but they're talking to your brain. But if you develop, like the Stoics have, or cognitive psychotherapy is a really good thing people should get into as well. The Feeling Good Handbook is a great introduction. You can identify the subconscious thoughts of darkness, you said, or doom or gloom or fears. And you can get good at identifying the subconscious thoughts, pulling them out, screaming into the light, analyzing them and rationalizing them in the Stoic way. And it takes away their power. Last thing I'll say, I know I go on a bit, but Neil, Many years ago, I had a lot of stress in my life. My job, family, a lot of stuff. And I got through it all. But I began to learn around a decade or two ago this thing about our subconscious thoughts. And I began to instinctively realize I could suddenly, in the middle of the day, feel kind of depressed out of the blue. I'm procrastinating. I don't feel like doing this. And Jesus, feel depressed. And I began to learn over time that I could actually go into my own mind. It's not rocket science, it's cognitive psychotherapy. I could go into my own mind and find the fleeting thoughts, the undercurrent of worries, concerns under the surface, my subconscious, and identify what they were that was making me feel depressed and miserable. And I could take them out, think about them, and then free myself from them. It's the most powerful tool in the world. I mean, cognitive psychotherapy has been used to treat depression that's been completely intractable or resistant to all the drug class for that. Sorry.
I'm listening to you. Don't you think too that to give the devil his due, one of the psyop, you talked about a psyop, and there's been huge psyops have been played against the people for the longest time. And we've been given the wrong idea about what happy actually is. Or we've been sold happy as the only thing worth having. And we've furthermore been told that happy is to be achieved by having whatever, loads of money, loads of stuff. And actually what's been achieved there is to take away from people the absolute value of all the other textures of experience. Your sadness, challenge, anxiety, a punch in the mouth, they're all part of what has to be experienced. They're not bad things to be avoided. When they come along, they all give. And happiness is great, in the same way that a glass of wine is great, but you can't be drunk all the time.
Yeah.
And people have been missold for it is what they ought to be aspiring to. And it means that increasingly when people encounter any kind of setback, depression, feeling anxious, that's it, I've got to get away from it. No, actually, you take the sadness and the anxiety and all of these other things that are just part of the rainbow of colours of life. And they are all as valuable and as useful as this transient concept of happiness, which the bad actors have persuaded. If you're not happy all the time, your life is not worth living. It's not right.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely straight from the annals of Stoicism, all those concepts as well, Neil. Incredibly so. Happiness is something, yes, with hard work, virtuous living, and all the other things, which just happen to be in Stoicism, you can achieve happiness. But what we've been sold is safism. We've been told for the last 30 years, and some of it, to be honest, is not just the modern population falling apart. Some of it is grassroots up. Everyone's become just soft and nutty. But a lot of it has been orchestrated too. I mean, remember Nicholas Rockefeller told the filmmaker Aaron Russo back in the early 90s or late 90s, spilled the beans and told Aaron Russo that Rockefeller Foundation and all of their agencies and media helped push the women's lib movement from behind the scenes. And the simple reasons were, though Russo couldn't understand, why would the richest, most powerful people and ex-presidents want to drive that? It's counterintuitive. And he just smiled and laughed and he said, well, we couldn't tax half the population. But the other big thing was a lot of children were getting educated by their mothers at home. And we need the children to be educated through our school system, through the state. So a lot of the things that society has gone to hell in a handbasket are grassroots, and they are the growth of technology and the safety of having been a few generations since World War II. A lot of it's natural, in fairness, but a lot of it as well is orchestrated. And they're driving the social order to want safism and no personal responsibility. That's another key thing. A friend of mine, a great thinker, told me. He said 30, 40 years ago, we had a concept of I'm responsible for my whatever and you're responsible for yours. And it was almost like a common law. It was an understanding. You know, you can't drive a car through my window and roll over me, whatever. But we each have responsibility for our own stuff, and there's personal autonomy. Now look at what happened during Cerveza. My mask protects you. You could make me sick. You saw what they did just there. They suddenly took away a fundamental of human personal responsibility. You're responsible for your own manner, your own family, your own people. You're not responsible if someone over there gets a bloody cold. It's absurd. It's insane. So I just thought that was a great example. Society has been made to the point now that in schools, everyone gets a trophy. No one gets to strive to try and do better next time. Everyone gets a prize, right? Everyone has to be safe. Safism has gone out of control now. 30 years ago, workplaces were dangerous. People drove complete shit heaps, and there were crashes because wheels fell off. Okay, things needed cleaning up. Look at us now. We're talking about 10-mile-an-hour zones, right? Industry can hardly do any work. Double, triple lockout. Safety departments have grown huge, and they want more rules so they can continue to grow. The bureaucracies. This engine that has taken us away from the risk managing Homo sapiens, the problem solver, you know, risk reward, cost benefit, all these trade-offs that humans did for millions of years. And now suddenly we're all in an iPhone and everything needs to be super safe. We are weak. Now there's a minority that are still very strong, and you and I know a lot of those communities, and they are growing, I think. There's a rejection of woke. There's an increasing young people are hitting the gym. They're eating carnivore diets, some of them. They're beginning to do these risk kind of sports. I think we're seeing a resurgence, which gives me great hope of awareness that something's rotten. And I think an increasing minority are beginning to search for their humanity again. And they're beginning, most important of all, just beginning to look up. Because that's what they haven't been doing for 30 years. I hadn't done it until 8 years ago. Just look up and realize, hold on a minute, all this nonsense around me that I don't agree with isn't just society becoming stupid by itself. A lot of these are NGOs and policies and coming from Europe, etc. So if people look up, they'll begin to see where the rot is coming from.
Ivor Cummins, that I think is the note upon which I would like to leave our conversation until we pick it up the next time. Perfect, thank you.
Thank you, Neil, and anytime we'll continue.
Perfect. Yeah, don't have too much safe.
Oh, live a little, man. Jesus, we're Homo sapiens. We came through the Ice Age. We were down to 1,000 breeding pairs. We nearly lost it all. We got through it. We took risk. Risk is reward. Risk
Problem
is everything.
solvers. Brilliant.
Problem solvers.
Thanks, Ivor.
Thank you, Neil. Good luck. That'll do it, guys, and hope you enjoyed. And, of course, I have to say, if anyone can help with PayPal or Patreon, you know, I do Zooms once a month, and I do a couple of vlogs with lots of free content and extra content. It'd be great if you could provide some support for all the work I do. And huge appreciation to my existing patrons, PayPal supporters. And, of course, the YouTube algorithm now is just gone insane, so it demonetizes anything that mentions their Cerveza sickness or certain geopolitical things or worldwide organizations. So it's quite crazy. So demonetization further takes away income, unfortunately. But sure, we just got to manage within the insane world that we're currently in. Anyway, any support is hugely appreciated. So till next time.